All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the roundtable on the Crimea crisis. And before we get into that, I just want to mention two events, one coming later this week and then one next week. By the way, I'm Brian Taylor. I'm the director of Moynihan European Research Centers. On Thursday, this Thursday, April 3rd, we have Pierre Chabal from Le Havre University in France talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's Thursday at 12 in room 341 in Eggers Hall. And then next Wednesday, on April 9th, we have Milada Vakudova from the University of North Carolina talking about the EU in the Western Balkans. That's at 12:30, also in room 341 in Eggers Hall. Also, there's a sign-up sheet going around. If you're not on the mailing list for Moynihan European Research Centers, please sign up so you can find out about further events. So our roundtable today has three speakers. First, we'll hear from Kateryna Pischikova, who's a visiting scholar at Cornell Institute for European Studies and the author of Promoting Democracy in Post-Communist Ukraine, The Contradictory Outcomes of U.S. Aid to Women's NGOs, which was published by Lynn Reiner in 2011. Then we'll hear from me. I'm a professor of Russian politics here. My most recent book on Russia was called State Building in Putin's Russia. That came out also in 2011. And then last, we'll have Dean James Steinberg. Most of you know the dean's biography, but he was Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy Head of the Deputy National Security Advisor. And he also used to write a lot on Europe, including a book, An Ever Closer Union, European Integration and Its Implications for the Future of U.S.-European Relations. So each of us will talk about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer. And Kateryna will start us off.
Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to talk here. Thank you all for coming, for your interest in this part of the world. By the way, I am Ukrainian myself. I come from a city of Kharkiv, which is in the second biggest city in the northeast. You have a map, so you know, in case you were wondering, in the northeast of Ukraine, just 60 kilometers from the Russian border, and that's one of the places across the border. It's called Belgorod, where the Russian troops are now being increasingly amassed, and there seems to be a disturbing Russian military presence. Obviously, the crisis in Ukraine now has multiple dimensions, and there's been a very disturbing, problematic case of the kind of a blitz annexation of Crimea, which is circled with in red, by Russia, that has not been recognized by the majority of states around the world, has been deemed to be violating international law. The crisis in Ukraine itself, beyond the Crimean issue, also has multiple dimensions. There's a domestic dimension, which largely has to do with the oust of President Yanukovych and an attempt at a regime change, an attempt at changing, coming sort of through a revolutionary scenario. There's the kind of regional geopolitical dimension, and that's where the positions and the kind of tensions between Russia and the EU and the competing regional integration schemes seem to increasingly clash, despite the attempts at forging the dialogue over the future of the countries that are in both Russia's and European Union's neighborhoods. There's clearly also an international dimension to this crisis. Some argue really with sort of far-reaching implications for the world order in more broader terms. So what I would like to do now in the next 10 minutes is to focus really mostly on the domestic side of the events, and really to argue that the Crimea case is also part of the bigger puzzle. So I will not go that much into details on what has happened in Crimea with the annexation, but really try to give you a bit of a background on what was going on in Ukraine politically at the moment, domestically speaking. So most of you will remember that the crisis, the tensions, and the protests in Ukraine started in late November because President Yanukovych declined to sign a far-reaching association agreement with the European Union. And the reason it provoked such large-scale protests domestically are twofold. One is that the president himself, who was elected in 2010, so was not really for that long in power, in free and fair, transparent elections, possibly the most democratic elections Ukraine has had in its post-Soviet history, ended up centralizing power quite dramatically over his term, and really perpetuating the system that was mostly based on corruption and curtailing the safeguards, curtailing the system of the rule of law. And so internally in Ukraine, the prospect of further association with the European Union also had this meaning, this implication of really securing a safeguard on further centralization of power by the president. It really, many citizens saw it as a way to really, that would put a stop on this kind of practice and would probably improve the governance in the country. So that's why the whole trajectory of the protests that went on for 3 months from late November to late February was partly provoked by this foreign policy decision of not pursuing closer ties with the European Union, but was very quickly linked to these really domestic grievances of lack of rule of law, centralization of power, corruption. And so the unifying kind of agenda for most protesters was really this question of how to improve the quality of politics domestically, how to improve the quality of governance, how to make sure that there is commitment to deep and sustainable reform by political leaders in the country. So this is something that has to be kept in mind. The other issue is that we also have to remember that the degree of violence and intimidation that was largely sponsored or, let's say, supported by the president was really unprecedented for Ukrainian post-Soviet history, and that what mobilized citizens even more vis-a-vis the president, this really backlash and this outrage at the fact that the president seemed to be ready to employ so much violence against his citizens. And so the president was eventually ousted on February 21st, which indeed happened after the most dramatic round of violence. Interestingly, he fled the country right after signing an interim agreement that was between the president and the three leaders of political opposition parties that was brokered by three foreign ministers of three European countries, and interestingly by a representative of Russian government who was mediating the negotiations but did not decline to sign the actual document. Why this is important? Because this is, for the Russian government, this remains the last legitimate document that came out of Kiev, this roadmap to solving the crisis that was envisioning a series of reforms that were also among the protesters' demands, but was also giving a longer lifeline to the president. The president was supposed to stay in power till December this year and then eventually step down and call for early elections. And so the Russian position on this is that this was the last legitimate document that came out of, they kind of forget the fact that they never signed it. And so this was the last legitimate document that came out of Kiev, and the Russian position is that the government that was voted by parliament after the President Yanukovych fled the country is not a legitimate one, and that the government of Russia is not going to recognize the president that is going to be voted now on May 25th in Ukraine. Now, in terms of the political process that kind of evolved in this post-revolutionary phase, so in addition to this kind of external pressure of non-recognition and military pressure from Russia, the political process itself in Ukraine is quite fragile and full of contradictions, which is obviously not so surprising in a post-revolutionary context. What happened in parliament was that the moment throughout the crisis and the 3 months of protests, the parliament was not really a place where, it did not seem to be a place where the stalemate between the opposition and the president could be resolved, because it was till the very last moment dominated by the majority that was supporting the president till the very last moment. And what happened after the latest round of violence and when the president fled the country was that most of his party jumped ship denounced the violence and said that the full responsibility for what happened for the victims was with the president that just fled. So that effectively created a new majority in parliament that then very quickly voted a number of legislative acts, voted for the interim president, and for the new government. Now, why this is obviously not an ideal situation is, of course, that these are the same deputies, and this is the same parliament that is still in place, that is kind of implicated in the political stalemate that was accompanying the protests and the violence in the capital over the 3 months. And so most of the citizens see the kind of political solution that is now we see now in Kiev with the parliament, the new majority in the parliament, and the government that this majority has voted as a kind of a temporary solution that should just bridge us towards a new government, towards new president, and towards real political change. So this is not really perceived yet, I think, by most citizens as a real political change. And it has to also to be remembered that the political opposition parties, they were not really spearheading these protests over the last 3 months. They were really trying to mediate between the protesters and the state institutions. They were doing this quite unsuccessfully. And so, again, the fact that one of the major opposition parties is now controlling most of the positions in government is again seen as sort of a temporary solution. These are mostly the same faces that have been in power for many, many, many years in Ukraine, and there is a sense among the citizens that because of the violence that took place, because of sort of the trauma of what has happened, the victims, you know, the fate of the victims deserves a better outcome than just a reshuffle of familiar faces in the government. So this creates a sort of a fairly fragile political situation that has to be kept in mind when we are thinking also of these kind of more broader regional tensions, and also the fact that since it's only one opposition party that seems to be calling the shots in the government, the parts of electorate in Ukraine that voted against that party back in 2012 in the parliamentary elections feel like they might not really be represented in what is going on now in the central government. And so the important thing is that the upcoming presidential elections is potentially an opportunity to partially regain legitimacy by the central authorities in Kiev, by making sure that this is an inclusive and transparent process, and hopefully the candidate that wins is seen as a bit more representative of different regions in Ukraine. And another open question is how quickly parliamentary elections can be called, because the current parliament, as I mentioned, was voted in 2012. They still have quite a few years to go, but there seems to be a consensus among Ukrainians that they would rather see a renewal of the legislature much sooner, and that would certainly, again, if done properly in a sort of transparent and inclusive manner, that would help renovate the politics and sort of create ownership over forthcoming events. Now, obviously, where does the Russian military pressure comes into this whole picture in this clearly complex situation? As I mentioned, I think the annexation of Crimea is a big problem and for many reasons in itself, but it also can be seen as part of this sort of a bigger strategy, a bigger situation in which Russia is trying to regain its control and to have influence over the domestic politics in Ukraine. And so, in a way, the military buildup, beyond the question of whether Russia is really planning to move in militarily in the mainland in Ukraine, I think is already creating these kind of problematic domestic effects of putting the country in this situation where it's increasingly feeling itself on the brink of war. This might have a unifying effect on the Ukrainian population, sort of the rally around the flag effect, but it might also, in many ways, strengthen the kind of more centrifugal forces whereby some regions of Ukraine with stronger ties to Russia, or simply the regions that do not really feel like sacrificing their economic ties with Russia, might feel like the failures of the government in Kiev and the pressure from Russia might combine to actually further help fracture Ukraine. So I think this is something we have to keep in mind. And this is already being exploited not only by Russia itself, but obviously by various stakeholders who are interested in having a sort of weaker central government in Ukraine and stronger autonomies within different regions, notably the regions in the north and east of the country. And so the most recent discussion now that's being brokered by Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov on the question of whether Ukraine has to become a federal state is part of this process, and we have to obviously be watching out to how that is going to go, what the actual federalization and the degree of autonomy means for different regions in Ukraine. Is it about really crippling decision-making in Kiev, or is it really about sort of safeguarding the minority rights and ensuring better self-government in different regions?
Great. Thanks, Kateryna. She was very disciplined being on time. Hopefully the next speaker will be as well. That's me, so I'll have to do a good job keeping track of time here. Okay. I want to make 2 points. The first is about what I see as the thinking of Vladimir Putin and the rest of the Russian political elite. And in that respect, I think from their point of view, and this is not just Putin's view, but the view of most of the Russian political elite, the annexation of Crimea is historically just and legitimate, and even from their point of view, somewhat defensive. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And I would add they think it's about time that Russia is sort of standing up for itself in a way they saw it not doing over the previous post-Soviet period. The second thing I want to talk about are what the implications are of this for Russian domestic politics, which I think are very important, in fact, key to understanding Putin's actions. And here I see Russia as continuing to move in a more authoritarian direction in light of this crisis. But I don't necessarily think that means that the political system is particularly strong or stable as it might seem from the outside. So on the first point, what Putin is thinking, lots of people have speculated on this. I'm going to allow myself to do the same as well. Putin's image in the U.S. is not so good. I saw the most recent poll from Gallup on this. He has a 9% favorable rating in the U.S. He's never been that popular in U.S. domestic politics, and we could speculate on why, but 10 years ago, his ratings were not 9%. It was more like 35, 40% of American citizens, had a fairly positive image of Putin, and that's gone down fairly steadily and then dropped off a cliff in the last 2 months. There's this actor named Nathan Fillion. Some of you might know who he is. Works a lot with Joss Whedon, who directed The Avengers and also previously Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly and various things. And Nathan Fillion said that Joss Whedon said to him once, he said, the bad guy doesn't think he's the bad guy, right? So Putin doesn't think he's the bad guy here, even though we may see him as the bad guy in the U.S. And I think he's been fairly transparent about his motivations. If you go out and find the text of his press conference from March 4th or his speech to the nation and to the parliament on March 18th, he was fairly explicit about his motivation, and I don't think it was just for either domestic or foreign consumption. You can find this in English if you want to read it. And first of all, it's important to understand, and Kateryna alluded to this, is that the events in Kiev, from the point of view of Putin and the rest of the Russian political elite, it's not a revolution, but an illegal and illegitimate anti-constitutional coup. That's the language they use to describe it, and I think it's what they believe about the events in Kiev. So the current government there is illegitimate as far as they're concerned. And further, what happened in Ukraine was a geostrategic defeat from the Russian point of view, and it was brought about by the West in general and the U.S. in particular. Okay? In his March 4th press conference, Putin at one point referred to, he has this image of American employees of some laboratory conducting experiments like on rats, not understanding the consequences of what they are doing. So the West, as far as he is concerned, is out to get them, and the Russian political elite shares that view. And they think that Ukraine and other countries of the former Soviet Union would naturally align themselves with Russia for cultural, historical, and economic reasons. So if there's any indication that these countries want to move towards association with the EU or association with NATO, that must be because EU and NATO countries are doing something to pull them, because their natural orientation is to be close to Russia. So these are externally inspired events as far as they're concerned. And the West is cynical enough in their view to ally with violent extreme nationalists to bring this about. So if any of you watch Russian TV, which you probably don't, but if you do, you would see frequent reports on neo-Nazis and fascists who are rampaging in the streets in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. Furthermore, they see the events in Kiev as not something new, but part of a long-term, very cynical game played by the U.S. and the West towards Russia to weaken and isolate Russia. And they would point to events such as NATO expansion, and in particular, what people refer to as the colored revolutions, which took place in Tbilisi in 2003, the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution in Kiev in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, et cetera. So this is all part of a Western sort of inspired event. And worse for them, they call this the Orange Plague, right, after the Orange Revolution. This Orange Plague is something that the West is determined to spread to Russia itself. All right, so it's not just about bringing countries like Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova into the Western sphere, but ultimately overthrowing the current Western government and bringing a more pro-Western government to power. So if you read speeches by Putin and other members of the political elite and interviews over many, many years, they talk about things like jackals who scavenge outside foreign embassies. So these are NGOs who get grants from Western organizations. They refer to them as jackals. In 2011, when there were major protests in the streets of Moscow about a falsified election, Putin publicly said that the State Department was funding the opposition. And from their point of view, you can sort of see it because what the U.S. would call democracy promotion or civil society promotion amounts to regime change in Russia, because Russia has an authoritarian regime, and if they had more democracy and if they had a stronger civil society, it's quite possible that Putin would not be in power. He is very popular, but he's very popular in the context of a controlled authoritarian regime in which access to free media and free political participation doesn't take place. So throughout the crisis, he has highlighted the threat from the West and the extreme disorder taking place in Kiev. And part of the reason he focuses on the disorder in Kiev is to explain to Russian domestic audience that internal stability is very important. States in that part of the world can be very fragile, and every effort must be made to maintain the existing political order and follow constitutional procedures, which in his terms means keeping himself in power. So in that light, the events in Kiev and the response to them by Russia in Crimea is a defensive move against this Western kind of encroachment. Further, it's historically just from their point of view, because Crimea has a long historical association with Russia, going back for several centuries. Last week was the 160th anniversary of the Crimean War, in which Britain and France fought against Russia. And so they have important military assets there. Important battles were fought there in the Great Patriotic War, World War II. It's ethnically Russian. Russian is the dominant language of the peninsula, et cetera. So they see this as reversing a historical injustice. Many of you probably know and have heard about the 1954 decision to transfer internal authority over Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. I can talk more about that and why that happened if people want. It wasn't because Khrushchev was drunk or anything like that. There were good administrative reasons for doing it, but nevertheless, from the Russian point of view, this is historically Russian territory. And so here's a chance for Russia to stand up and protect its interest after the West has been on this long sort of offensive push into former Soviet space. Now, I say all this not to justify Russian behavior, because it's clear that what they did was illegal under international law. And I also think it may turn out to be problematic for Russia in the medium term. And one reason I think that's true is by winning Crimea, I think it's possible that Putin has lost Ukraine. And the whole point of the initiative was try and control the Ukrainian government, because Putin's initiative since 2011 to create a Eurasian economic union depends heavily on Ukraine being part of that economic union. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Russia are not enough. Russia is important to that vision. And by taking Crimea, he has laid the groundwork for potentially unifying the rest of the Ukrainian population against allying itself with Russia and seeking further association with the West. And we saw last week how the IMF and the United States government, as well as the EU, have finally put significant money on the table for Ukraine. They had never been willing to do this before. Okay, so back in November, when Yanukovych aligned himself with Moscow rather than Brussels, Moscow was offering a lot more money than Brussels was. Well, that's not the case anymore. And so this has stimulated the West to actually make some economic commitments to Ukraine that they probably would not have made otherwise, okay? So his current actions in terms of the mobilization of troops on the border and Lavrov's meeting with Kerry and talking about the need for promoting Russian language in Ukraine, for federalizing Ukraine, all of that is an attempt by the Russian government to try and maintain some influence in Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea. And they have lost the 2 million voters in Ukraine who are most sympathetic to Russia by annexing Crimea. All right, I have 5 minutes for my second point about the domestic implications. These I see as not particularly good in both political and economic respects. Since Putin came back to power in 2012, there's been a considered campaign on the part of government to further tighten the screws. This is in reaction to the opposition movement that arose in Russia in 2011, 2012 over protests around the falsification of elections. And the message coming out of the Kremlin over the last 2 years has been that this opposition, as I alluded to earlier, is foreign-inspired and alien to Russian culture. And so this is why they have been on the attack about LGBT rights, making such a big deal about Pussy Riot and all these sorts of things. All of this is an attempt to paint the Russian opposition as somehow not naturally Russian and not sort of sympathetic with traditional conservative Russian values. In his speech on March 18th, marking the annexation of Crimea, he referred at one point in the speech to a fifth column inside Russia made up of national traitors. And we have seen over the last couple of weeks closing of media outlets, including extending to the internet, which is new for Putin's Russia. The internet had always been quite a free platform in Russia, but several outlets have been closed down over the last 2 weeks. Now, Putin is very popular right now. His popularity ratings have gone up over 80% in Russia, which equal the ratings that he had in 2007, 2008, the previous height of his popularity. And I should say he's always been very popular in Russia. His ratings have always been over 60%. And even in 2011, 2012, they still were 60%. And this has only contributed to that sense. But the problems internally, I think, are starting to pile up. And one problem that Vladimir Putin has in being in power for 14 years, either de jure or de facto, is that, he's getting a bit old, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you watch How I Met Your Mother. I never watched that show, but it's been running 9 years, right? And it might have been fresh 9 years ago, but it's about time for it to wind up, right? So if you're president of a country for 14 years and then want to stay another 10 years, who's going to want to watch this show running for 24 years? So, as this is going on, I think some internal problems are starting to pile up, and the biggest one is economically. During his first 2 terms from 2000 to 2007, 2008, growth was 7.5% a year, quite consistently. Last year it was 1.3%, and this is at a time when world energy prices, price for a barrel of oil is $110. In 2005, okay, so during his first 2 terms, they could balance the Russian budget with world energy prices, world oil prices at $20 a barrel. Now it takes $110 a barrel to balance the budget. Okay, so they have greatly increased domestic state spending on a whole host of things, including pensions, including salaries for state employees, including the military. But despite the fact that world energy prices are still quite high, growth has basically stagnated. Okay. And this is seen by most Russian economists as something that's not just temporary but systemic. And they say they need further institutional reforms is what they call it. But institutional reforms are just code word for a stronger rule of law, decreasing corruption and increasing transparency, which go against the entire trend in Russian domestic politics for the last 12 years. And I would add, although people have said some perhaps skeptical things about the sanctions that have been put in place by the U.S. government and the EU. Already over the last week, the economic minister and the finance minister have downgraded their projections for growth of the Russian economy by 1%. Right? These fairly minor sanctions so far have cost them 1% of GDP growth, which means going from basically 1.4, 1.5% to close to 0% over the next year. And this is not because of the sanctions on particular people, but what it implies for foreign investment, for capital flows, and those sorts of things, the price on the Russian stock market, et cetera. They're currently projecting capital flight from Russia in 2014 of $100 to $150 billion. And if that money is not being invested domestically in Russia, it's creating a problem for their growth projections. So I think the short-term bounce that Putin has gotten out of these events will dissipate over time as people's concerns return to more economic issues. And I think that's going to be true both at the mass level, but also somewhat at the elite level, because the elite is not totally unified around Putin or around this foreign policy course. And I see that I have talked myself out of time, so I will stop there and turn it over to Dean Steinberg.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks, Kateryna, for terrific presentations. For me, there's a particular irony in this crisis. My first trip as Deputy Secretary of State included a visit to Kiev, where I met with many of these distinguished individuals who you're now hearing about now. And while the precise contours of this crisis, I think, might not have been anticipated, the challenges that Ukraine has faced unsuccessfully over the time, 4 years, certainly contributed in many ways. And while I can look back with some satisfaction of the "I told you so" category, the fact is that a lot of people have been telling our friends in Ukraine for some time that the challenges that they faced were both external and internal, and the inability of the political and economic classes in Ukraine to effectively address those problems is an important part of the story, but not the part that I'm going to dwell on, because we have experts here who can talk even more about that in the discussion. I want to step back, and as Kateryna said, this is not just a regional problem, but a global problem, and focus on some of the broader 50,000-foot implications of this crisis. Over the past week, I've been in Brussels. I was on a panel in New York with Turki El Faisal, the former Saudi ambassador to the United States, and I was in Beijing. And the one thing all three places had in common is the only thing people wanted to talk about was Ukraine, which tells you something about the significance of this event and the fact that though each region, each country sees the Ukraine crisis through its own lens, it is indisputably the case that it is something that resonates in different ways, but in important ways around the globe in terms of our understanding of some of the fundamental issues about the nature of the international system that we live in and the roles of key actors in that system. And I want to focus just briefly on that and then have plenty of time for discussion. I think, for me, there's been a lot of discussion about this as questions about sovereignty and the norms against alteration of sovereignty by force. But in some ways, I think perhaps the most significant lesson being learned and trying to be digested here is the question about the significance of interdependence. There's a long line of thinking, the IR students in the room will know it well, that basically believe very strongly that growing interdependence, globalization, and the like would both act as a check on aggressive behavior and would also be a damper by virtue of the interdependence on actions that upset the system. That, frankly, that everybody had a stake in the system, and so revisionism would be difficult because it would be costly. And not only is this a descriptive view of the international system, but it actually became a formal part of the strategy of many countries, and not least of which vis-a-vis Russia. And what we've seen over the last decade, and it's manifest in things like the efforts to support Russia's WTO accession and the like, was a theory that by engaging and building Russia's ties to the system, making Russia less autarkic, having a greater stake in the system, that it would act as a constraint on Russia's behavior. That's obviously a lesson which is being revisited in a very powerful way from the crisis. Indeed, there's a danger, or there's a possibility, that the lesson is going to turn out to be the reverse, which is that actually rather than being a tool of the establishment, the existing order to constrain revisionism, that actually it becomes a constraint on the existing order to defend the existing order. And that the country that was those enmeshed in the interdependence was not Russia and those who are revisionists to the status quo, but rather those who would defend it because they have so much stake in Russia that they lack the tools to be able to respond effectively to Russia's extra-legal action. And in particular, the ability to use economic tools and in effect self-deterrence against being able to use these economic tools. And as we try to evaluate the choices that the European Union and the United States have been making, it seems like the more entwined you are with Russia, the less inclined you are to act. Indeed, that's part of the reason why the United States has acted somewhat more forcefully, is because our economic stake in Russia is smaller than that of most Europeans. And we see the tension and dilemma playing out dramatically in the case of Germany, which has deep, deep economic ties there. But even this famous classic leaked picture story about Cameron and the memo from his advisors, indicating that London wasn't going to take the lead because, after all, London is a place where so much of Russian economic activity of various sorts takes place. And so the irony that this strategy, which was designed in some ways to try to bring Russia into the mainstream, to normalize its behavior both internally and externally, has not been effective in deterring the land grab in Ukraine and in Crimea and potentially in Ukraine. And what's worse, has not been effective in changing the domestic politics in Russia. Indeed, you see, as Brian said, this kind of rallying around in a kind of classic populist nationalism way, a leader who's defied the international system, even at the potential cost to Russia. Now, we'll see how it plays out in the long run and whether these affects both the specifics of the sanctions and the kind of the systemic effect of the declines in the Russian stock market and the declines in the investment will cause people to have second thoughts about this. But certainly, at least in first blush, none of the strategy seems to have worked very effectively. Now, this obviously has important implications for other parts of the world, because as people look at kind of these 19th century disputes or older disputes in East Asia in particular, the question then becomes, are we facing a similar constellation in which strategies of engagement and interaction, which as a shibboleth have been seen in Eastern Europe for such time as war, is unthinkable because of the degree of economic interdependence, the interconnections, the global supply chains. Whether this turns out, much like nuclear weapons, is rather than deterring low-level violence and conflict, it actually enables it because the tools are too powerful to be used. They may backfire on the user, and therefore countries may be free to act. And without getting into the obvious specifics, there are a number of crises that have a territorial base in China, in and around China now, that seem to have some of the structural characteristics of the current crisis. So that's one big lesson that people are now having to think. The second is this question about whether we have the institutions that are necessary to take on these challenges. Where would the action come from? Where are the enforcers of the norms? If in fact the lesson, the new world order that the first President Bush talked about after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, that we had a global enterprise that rejected aggression, rejected the use of force, and a coming together of the international community. Where is that? I suppose there's some slight consolation that for once the United States, it was not the United States, but Russia that was marginally isolated in the Security Council. If you look at the vote, the General Assembly, if you look at the vote, the numbers on the Russian side are like the numbers that the United States often finds itself in, with a very motley and fairly unsavory group of countries supporting the Russian position, notably not including China, which abstained in the General Assembly, and really just a handful of states in this Russian enterprise, plus some of the less savory rogues like Venezuela who supported the Russians. So the norm is pretty strong, even though Russia seemed to be trying to pitch its action as kind of defying the West and the like. The so-called former non-aligned, the developing world certainly didn't line up with Russia. At the same time, where are the tools in the institutional arrangements that would make a difference? Most notably, obviously, in the European case, the OSCE. And the OSCE is particularly instructive in this case because many of the issues that were at stake are issues that theoretically were resolved by the collectivity, including Russia, during the first decade following the end of the Cold War, most notably in the Istanbul Declaration, which acknowledged the rights of states to choose their associations and the like. All of these principles that Russia had, at the time, under a previous Russian regime, had signed up to, but now seem to have fallen in desuetude. And of course, the return of the Security Council paralysis, which had characterized the Security Council during the Cold War, but which was supposed to have evaporated with the end of the Cold War, and really the lack of any significant mechanisms in the international community to take this nominal norm and make it an effective part of the international system. So two really big questions about the functioning of the international system. And then the place I'll end, which of course is if the international system, the international community is unable to respond to these challenges, where does the United States fit in and what does this mean for the United States role? And how does the United States both define its interests and what tools are available to it? And this, I think, is an enormous challenge for the United States, and it's a challenge which was apparent at the time of the crisis in Ukraine in 2008, which was, are these countries distant countries of which we know little and have little stake, or are these countries in which we need to draw a line and make a stand? And this has been a challenge for the United States because there are certainly, you can identify situations where the territorial integrity of a key ally might be infringed, in which the United States would clearly act. But the vast majority of cases are going to be those where it's not so clear. And so we have a record that stretches in the post-Cold War world from the decision in Kuwait, first President Bush saying this will not stand, to the second President Bush that said, well, we don't like it, but it has stood. That is the annexation, or the, not the annexation, but the interventions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And then as people have watched the Obama administration unfold, trying to understand where the Obama administration would draw its line, looking in the first cases to the interventions in the Middle East, and now to Ukraine. And the question about whether you can make the case for significant responses at the extreme, including military responses, in cases where, at least in the short term, there's neither a treaty obligation, which is the case vis-a-vis Ukraine, nor a very significant political stake beyond the generic stake in the functioning of the international system. And so as we watch the mobilization around the rest of eastern Ukraine, one has to ask the question, clearly this would be more significant for a variety of reasons than Crimea, but how much more significant, and what's the theory under which this would or would not trigger a more forceful intervention to include a military response by the United States? What is the slippery slope? Where do you draw the line? Is it only where there are treaty obligations? And if that's the case, is it true of all treaty obligations? Read Senkakus in the East China Sea. And so the question about both where the United States defines its interest and therefore where the deterrent effect exists in the system is very powerful. As uncertainty seems to resolve on the side of the United States not intervening, does that create more vacuums, more instability? On the other hand, if the United States tries to resolve that with a kind of categorical statement that we will intervene anywhere and everywhere the general principle of violations of sovereignty exist, is that something that will be supported by an American public, which, as the President likes to remind us, is war-weary? So let me stop with that.
Great. Perfect. Okay, we've got about 45 minutes for questions and answers. You can direct your questions to any one of the panelists or the panel as a whole. Because there are a lot of people here, which, first of all, I'm grateful for, but I also want to make sure people have time, so try and keep your questions brief. And to the extent that I'm going to play favorites, I will try and play favorites in favor of students, undergraduates and graduate students. And the professors can hold their tongues, right? Okay, Evan, yeah, grad student, all right.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Steinberg and Professor Taylor. Dean, do you think Beijing is learning a lot from this particular crisis, and can you give us a sense of whether or not Beijing is most likely to be more aggressive in the East and South China Sea as a consequence of the Crimean crisis? And Professor Taylor, to what extent do you think the national security establishment in the Kremlin is unified behind Putin, and to what extent is Putin more or less independent in making all kinds of decisions with regards to what's happening in Crimea, or whether or not an invasion of Ukraine is also a lot closer than we think? Thank you.
I'll go first.
Okay,
so there's no doubt that Beijing and everybody else in East Asia, Tokyo, Manila, Hanoi, are watching this very closely because they're watching both the general response of the international system and the specific response of the United States because there are some similarities, although not identical, to some of the challenges that are faced in the region. I think if you, on an explicit level, everybody in the leadership and are influential in Beijing would say, we would never do anything like that. We are focused on our internal economic development. This doesn't really have a lot of implications for us because we want to see a peaceful settlement of these disputes. And to the extent that there's any controversy, it's because of the provocations of others, not us. So you're looking at the wrong place. You don't need to worry about us. Worry about the sources of instability, which are elsewhere in the region. So you would never get anybody say, oh, yeah, we're trying to figure out if this is a good time to make a power grab. But I do think it is, because the trying to understand the role and the intentions of the United States is so important to everybody in East Asia, they can't help but think about this in the context of trying to understand how the United States sees its role, what tools it has available, how it defines our own interest, and how does that affect the way we define our interest in the region. And I think it's important, and certainly as American policymakers, you want to resist the idea of generalizations about these things. Each case is unique. Each case has its own set of facts. Most importantly, particularly with respect to the territorial issues in East Asia, of course, is the fact that we have two treaty allies involved in these disputes, which puts a different character on them. And American policymakers are correct to recognize that it's a difference. Whether it's a difference that makes a difference, of course, is another question. And I think that it's also the case that, and following on some of Brian's points, that I think whatever the calculus in Beijing about how it's dealing with some of these disputes, that there is less of this using opposition to the United States as a political strategy in Beijing. I mean, I think certainly if you read the Duma speech around the annexation, I mean, Putin is more and more embracing kind of the civilizational alternative to, and even in Xi Jinping's China Dream speeches, it's not the same. So I think it's dangerous to draw too much of a comparison, but there's no doubt that everybody in East Asia is trying to understand the deeper meaning of this.
Okay, in terms of the elite and the national security elite in Russia, we don't know a whole lot about how the decision was made. There are reports that have come out that are fragmentary and not particularly well-sourced, but the reports that I've read suggest it was a smaller group than the Security Council that actually made the decision to send troops into Ukraine. So they have a formal Security Council, which has about 18 members, but allegedly it was a smaller group of around 6 or 7 people who made the decision, most of them who share similar backgrounds to Putin, coming from the former KGB, FSB kind of background. And the names that have been listed never include anyone from what people might call the economic or liberal wing of the Russian political elite, including, I would say, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who apparently, according to these reports, was not directly involved in the decision. Having said that, I don't know for sure, right? I mean, these are fairly weak reports, but that's what people have been saying. Now, more generally, I think it's important to think about the Russian political and economic elite not as a monolith sort of totally unified around Putin, but as a group of sort of competing clans that are informally linked and cross many different economic and political lines. At the moment, there's no reason to think that any particular group would be sort of speaking out about this policy at all, right? There seems to be total unity around it. But we are hearing from people more on the sort of economic side talking in concerned terms about what the implications of this might be for their growth strategy over the 3 to 5 year period. So in that sense, the discussion has broadened out a bit from what it apparently was 3 weeks ago when the decision was made to move into Crimea. So. Yes.
David from Georgia. I would like to ask just for a brief comment to James Steinberg. What do you think about President Obama's last statement in Brussels that not Georgia and not Ukraine are on the path of granting MAP in the nearest future, and what kind of results we can expect from this statement for these countries? And the second one will be, do you think that is there any readiness inside of political group, which is right now running for political power in Ukraine, to conduct any real reforms in Ukraine to defeat corruption and to do any real things, just to forget about international actors and factors, do something real inside the Ukraine, because this country was struggling for last 10 years and they were doing nothing.
Kateryna can answer that part of it. I certainly hope so. But let me just talk about the NATO angle here. All of American strategists are divided into two camps, right? Those who think that NATO enlargement was a historic mistake, and those who think it was absolutely essential to the consolidation of peace and stability in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And sort of how you come out on that broad philosophical question obviously affects how you think about the case with Georgia and Ukraine. For those of us who supported expansion, the reality is that the countries that are in seem to be more stable than the countries that are out, and the dangers of incursions on sovereignty are less against those that are in than those that are out. That whatever temptations there are to revisionism, that in some ways the NATO expansion has been a brake on that, and the countries which have been, unfortunately, the victims who got caught in between. And that seems to be the story of Georgia and Ukraine. But there are others, obviously, who argue that this has been confrontational to Russia, has failed to respect legitimate interests of Russia, that we should see neutralization as an acceptable outcome that takes into account Russia's legitimate interests without harming the interests of the states in between. As I said, I mean, having been part of the advocacy for NATO expansion, I think it's essential that this be an option, that the basic principles of the Istanbul Declaration were essential, that if we believe in sovereignty and autonomy, the country should be able to decide who to be aligned with. At the same time, it's the responsibility of those countries not to use that shield as a kind of sword to antagonize or otherwise harm the perspectives of others, by not treating internal minorities well, or, there are a variety of provocations that could come with it. And so, it was always part of the NATO accession process that those factors should be taken into account. So, my personal orientation is to be supportive of that. I think on the long run it is stabilizing. But there's no question it won't help de-escalate the current crisis. I mean, I think that Russia's pretty dug in. I'll defer to Brian, but I think that this will be seen as a further provocation. And I think so part of the challenge here is, the understandable desire to de-escalate the current crisis, but at what cost? And there are historical analogies which people that I used to work for have used here, which I won't repeat. But it's a tough question because you can understand the argument both ways, and some of it has to do with kind of a deep conviction about sort of how order works in the international system.
On the reform, I mean, beyond the fact that we all hope for more reform, I think the big difference between what has happened in Kiev, but also throughout the country over the past 4 months, and the Orange Revolution of 2004 that Brian mentioned before, is that this seems to be the real revolution, not just the sort of mass mobilization behind a certain political leader who didn't get a fair treatment in the elections. I mean, this was much more bottom-up. It was much more spread throughout the country. There were protests and occupations of administrative buildings throughout the country. This was much more, this was a longer protest. Many more things were at stake, including, as I mentioned, the victims. So that I think by now there's a sense and a consensus in the society that this has come at too high a cost to squander. And that's one difference with the Orange Revolution. And so I think by now the expectation, especially on the part of the protesters or those who were supporting the protesters, which was not the majority of the Ukrainian population, but the part of the Ukrainian population that was really explicitly pro-protesters, there is a consensus that there has to be a real systemic change and not just a reshuffle in the leadership. And that's obviously speaks to your question of reform. So I think the few things to be watching out for in the coming months is one is, like, as I said, it's very likely that because of the bottom-up and kind of more systemic way the protests evolved, there is hope that some of the actors that got strength through these events may actually mobilize into more effective civic oversight campaigns, pushing for real reform for legislation. That just a few days ago, the Parliament finally passed the Transparency and Public Information Act, which was on the table for forever, and civic activists were not capable of convincing the Parliament to pass that kind of legislation. So there's a very long shopping list of the things that has to be done to reform the country. So there's hope there's going to be more linkage between the civic society, the civil society, and the political society and the state institutions, and there's going to be more oversight and pressure for more accountability because of the way the protests evolved. There's also, I think, the difference is in the degree of leverage that the actors, as the European Union, have gained over the current government, as opposed to any other government in Ukraine. I mean, this government is quite, it is in drastic need of financial help. It is in drastic need of technical assistance. And so this is a unique opportunity for the European Union specifically to use this for greater, to insist on greater political conditionality as well, in the sense that there has to be more oversight over how the financial assistance is being spent, but also that this comes as a whole reform package. Now, I think it remains to be seen whether this is going to take place. I think very briefly, one lesson from Georgia is obviously that what happened in Georgia is that there was a bit too much focus on some kind of reforms that had to do with efficiency, again, maybe fighting like petty corruption, and not so much on really deeper democratization. So that's probably something we, hopefully the lesson that's been learned. But the big danger now with the Russian behavior is that, as I mentioned, this whole situation of being on the brink of war obviously goes against this kind of these kinds of attempts, because it makes it much easier for the political elite to put certain, to sidetrack certain reforms, because they're not really the necessity of the kind of military crisis management moment. It gives more space to the leaders that are more radical and populist, as opposed to the leaders who are maybe a bit more serious and pushing for certain policies, as opposed to just sort of selling their tough personalities to the electorate. There's more risk that maybe otherwise critical voices will self-censor, because there is a risk of, sort of rally around the flag and let this government, just survive at any cost. So I think this is why there's kind of this important interlinkage between the regional situation, the pressure from Russia, and the kind of future of domestic political reform.
Great. In the second row here. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a social anthropologist from Binghamton University, graduate student. So I have a two-part question. So historically speaking, there was a significant level of anti-nuclear protests against the Soviet Union in the 1980s in Crimea, predominantly ethnic Crimean Tatars. So on one level, it was mentioned that the population there is about 60% Russian-speaking, but I'm curious about the ethnic Crimean Tatar population. What's their role in this, since this is predominantly tension between Ukraine and Russia? So I want to know a little bit more about their role in this. And then the other half is about the G7's sanctions against Russia. And so I want to know about, on one level, countries that are so dependent on Russia for energy, but also about Crimea itself, the role of Russian encroachment in terms of energy. You know, it was a little bit briefed in your discussion, so if you have anything more to add to that.
Just briefly on the Tatars, it is indeed sort of a shame that they get overlooked in these discussions. They are about 13% of the Crimean population at the moment. It's also it used to be, let's say, before the Russian military occupation, it used to be the fastest growing part of the population. They are, it's not, I mean, they're obviously all Tatar speaking, but it's not very clear what's their preferred second language is. It is sort of so again, like, are they more comfortable speaking Russian, Ukrainian, or both? They have, it's the only mostly mobilized and cohesive group in Crimea. They obviously returned to Crimea only in the late 80s and early 90s after the whole population was deported by Stalin in the second half of the Second World War. But the amazing part is that they maintain this identity and the kind of the cohesion as a minority group in Central Asia. And so there was quite a strong pro-Tatar movement in Central Asia and then in Crimea for the recognition of their status in Crimea. They had a very difficult uphill battle in Crimea to be recognized actually to be treated properly and recognized by the government in Kiev as well. So a little comment in the parentheses here is that I think part of the failure in the Crimea, part of the blame can be put on the central government as well. I mean, it didn't really have such a brilliant Crimea policy, unfortunately, and that's obviously, it doesn't just justify the Russian military occupation, but it explains how come it went so peacefully and so quickly, I think. And so the Crimean Tatars are really a hostage in this because they used to have a very strong alliance with the Ukrainian nationalist movement in the 90s. They are strongly pro-Ukrainian. They are very weary of now becoming part of Russia, not the least because of the reputation that Russia has for treating its Muslim minority groups. So it's not very clear what they said. They boycotted the referendum. They obviously oppose it, but it's not really clear what's going to happen to them now, or whether there's going to be some kind of ugly scenario of actually Crimea Tatar population being prosecuted. Many families started leaving because they fear this. So yeah, they're really sort of the real, in a way, the victim, the overlooked victim of this annexation.
So on energy, for those of you who are old enough to remember, the issue of particularly European dependence on Russian energy and its implications for political response is at least as old as the Carter administration and the Siberian gas pipeline incidents after the intervention in Afghanistan. And for 30 years, we've been talking about the need, both in the United States and Europe, to reduce our dependence, reduce their dependence in particular, on Russian energy to create more political options, not to mention economic options. And notwithstanding that, the degree of success in doing that is quite modest. And even since the intervention in Georgia, where the whole issue was re-energized, there's been very modest progress. So there's been some infrastructure built to start to build some north-south pipelines in Europe, in addition to the east-west pipelines. But there's no gas to put in them anyway, because we haven't built the interconnectors from Central Asia that would fill those pipelines. And the Russians have played a good game of using cheap contemporary prices to keep people hooked on their gas and oil and to keep the pipelines filled in that direction. It's true not just of Ukraine, but of Bulgaria and Romania and even Germany and others. And so once again, we have a lot of discussion about decreasing dependence on Russian energy, and maybe this time it'll happen. Certainly another issue is shale. That was in my discussions with the Ukrainians in 2009, we spent a lot of time talking about shale. Ukraine has a lot of natural energy, but because of corruption and government inefficiency, it has declined to develop it and would be in a different place today, and not at the risk of this blackmail that Russia continually plays, both either to cut it off or to raise the prices. They've been talking about enormous increases in the cost of gas to Ukraine, tripling the cost of Ukraine over the contract price in recent weeks. And so, and not only for Ukraine, where shale has been an option which was not explored for political reasons, including by some people who are identified as reformers, but also in Western Europe, and the concerns about environment and the like, which are all real, but have precluded the development of effective strategies to reduce the dependence on Russian energy. In a creeping level over time, this dependence is declining, LNG and the like, but it is still the case that today there would be significant short-term costs to many Central and West European countries if sanctions were to escalate and the Russians were to retaliate by significant measures on energy supply.
Sarah, yeah.
My question is for you, Professor Taylor. I was wondering, regarding your comments about the domestic implications and the further implications, if there were larger repercussions coming from this conflict in regards to the United States or Western European countries, do you think that Putin will be, in his popularity will decrease and he will be ousted eventually, or if at all?
His popularity can only go down, right? I mean, 80% is kind of an unsustainable number, and I think it's short term. What? Well, we didn't have good public opinion data on Stalin's popularity at the time. So it'll go down. The question is sort of how fast and how far. I think it'll stay up for quite a while, over 70%. But laws of gravity will kick in at some point. I think the real question about his standing is not going to be some kind of popular-based sort of mobilization or uprising, but if members of the political and economic elite feel that he has become a liability in terms of their interests. And that would partially be a reaction, perhaps, to declining domestic popularity, but it might equally be related to various economic problems that they may face over the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, a lot in Russia depends on the world energy prices, right? I mean, from 1992 to 1999, when Boris Yeltsin was president, the price of a barrel of oil was about $18. And, since Putin has been president, they've been much higher than that, starting in the early 2000s and going through today. So, given that 50% of their exports are energy, or 75% of their exports are energy, and 50% of their budget depends on energy, a lot depends on that, which if I could predict the future of world energy prices, I would probably not be teaching at the Maxwell School. I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere and enjoying my profits. But, lots of people think that the regime is fragile, but it's been there for 14 years, and, given Russian constitutional provisions, he can be president quite legally until 2024 if he gets elected in 2018. 4 months ago, many people suspected that he might not continue after 2018 and let someone else take another run at it like he did from 2008 to 2012. Now I think it's almost certain that he will try and extend that in 2018, but a lot can change before then. So, yeah, Kelsey.
Thank you. So this is a question primarily for the whole panel, but Dean Steinberg, you mentioned institutions such as the OSCE and how the policy of interdependence was not sufficient up until now. So my question is, with this idea of enforcers of the North, what kind of actors should be participating today, and what's possible, but what should that look like as well, and what's necessary at this stage in the game?
Well, it's a tough question because the level of organization of the international system is low, and countries do act where their interests lie. And I think it's interesting to watch China seek to deal with this because China has a lot of conflicting interests at stake and perspectives on the problem. On the one hand, it's a country that has a huge stake in the maintenance of territorial integrity. It talks about it all the time, and concerns about encroachments on its territorial integrity. On the other hand, it's also a country which is troubled by and uncomfortable with color revolutions for a variety of obvious reasons. And so it looks at this as, through this complicated lens, which is why basically it's trying to have it both ways or no ways. And that's, I cite it only because it's significant because you have enough ambivalence among key countries in the international system, ambivalence about the role of the United States, ambivalence about the current international order to prevent a consensus for developing. Because even with the de jure limitations of the Security Council and the veto, it's very different if Russia has to go it alone and use the veto. It can prevent mandatory actions from taking place, but there are costs that are associated with it. And so the question then becomes, are there ways over time that countries converge, strongly enough around one or other of these norms? And I think what we're seeing is slightly positive in the sense that despite the relatively low standing of the United States in many of the countries, people still voted against Russia here. I mean, I think the votes of the African countries in particular and others is significant in the sense that there are costs here, and it means that the options are constraining. And I think we see this a little bit in East Asia, where I think China is very conscious of kind of the soft power consequences of being seen to be too unilateral in its actions and worrying about the long-term consequences, even if it could, quote, get away with it. So I think I believe enough that norms have some constraining influence that is an important part of it beyond the formalities of the kind of transnational or enforcement authority of the institutions. But unless there's a pretty broad consensus around them, the constraint is fairly weak.
Did you want to add anything? Okay.
I see a student next to Paul. Yes, that would be you.
So, Professor Cho, you said Putin kind of won Crimea but lost Ukraine. I'm saying, are there any other regions of Ukraine that is, whether politically unstable or financially unstable, that kind of joining with Russia would kind of sway that or be an attractive option? Or is more leaning towards Russian culture or?
Yeah. I should let Kateryna answer this one first, and I'm going to go to a couple other maps that I had on standby, just in case this question came up. So, do you want to start, or should I start?
As you prefer. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think now we have to remember that Crimea is a very peculiar case within Ukraine for all these reasons that we've already mentioned. So there isn't any other region like Crimea on the Ukrainian mainland. Having said that, if you look at the east, the other two red regions would be the most Russia-leaning regions. The orange ones, maybe sort of the second tier. The opinion polls show that none of these are actually pro-Russia. They're Russian-speaking, but they're not pro-Russia, and that's obviously a very important distinction. They have, having said that, they have very different economic setup as well within the regions, and so the two red regions happen to be also the two regions that are most heavily subsidized by the capital, by Kiev. That these are sort of industrial mining regions. Donetsk is the mining region that have a sort of accumulated more grievances against the kind of economic development they've been experiencing that was very breeding the inequality, breeding top-level corruption. So it's sort of a more kind of dramatic scenario, very few billionaires coming from that region, and then extremely impoverished population. That is not the case in the orange bit that you see on the map. And so specifically for the two regions of Donetsk and Lugansk that you see in red, I think there's more scope for kind of mobilizing the grievances against the capital, building on the kind of promises that maintaining the ties with Russia may be a better thing economically. So it's not really a sort of an ethno-linguistic question, but there is, I think, more scope for kind of pushing for more centrifugal forces within Ukraine. And so I think that unless Russia, for some reason that's kind of difficult to predict now, really moves in militarily at this point, if it doesn't, I think the more immediate risk is that these are the regions that are going to be driving for the process of greater federalization in Ukraine, and that might mean a whole lot of things. We don't know what that might boil down to, whether that's kind of just greater self-governance and the possibility to elect their own local authorities, keeping more taxes, or whether it's really the question of sort of having a possibility to veto big decisions in Kiev, like the foreign policy decisions. That would be obviously the Russian scenario. And interestingly, between the two red regions, we've only seen big clashes in Donetsk. And so there's lots of speculations now about the local economic elite, the oligarchy group that comes from Donetsk, whether they're actually intentionally kind of fomenting this tension to use their region in the bargaining game vis-a-vis Kiev, they're sort of doing their local politics thing to make sure that the kind of deal with Kiev and between Kiev and Moscow is something that is benefiting that particular economic group. It's obviously difficult to say how far that will go, but it's really, I personally do not really see any indication of like a real possibility of another Crimea on Ukrainian mainland. And so I would be tempted to interpret the military buildup on the Russia-Ukraine border is really, again, sort of the bullying tactic and kind of trying to mount the pressure against the government in Kiev. But I don't know if you, Brian, want to.
Let me just add a couple things about these maps. So the first one is from the 2001 census at the level of counties and municipalities, and it's ethnic self-identification. And you can see that Crimea is Russian identified, and a couple of areas along the border are Russian identified, and there are a few other areas in the south and west that identify with Bulgaria and Romania, and the people ethnically identify that way. But the vast number of municipalities and counties are ethnically Ukrainian once we take Crimea out of the question. The next one is about native or preferred language, and there you see the red regions that Russian is the predominant language, and then it changes as we move west. It's a truism of the study of Ukrainian politics that it's split between west and east, and like many truisms, that's somewhat true and also obscures maybe more important truths. So if we look at the next map, this is Kateryna's home region of Kharkiv. It's really the capital, Kharkiv, that's really Russian-speaking, and then the rural areas are more Ukrainian-speaking. So, you know, depending on what level of detail you want, the picture gets a lot more complicated than just saying the East is pro-Russian and the West is pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian. Okay, so many hands. I'm going to go to Ernst because he's a loyal follower of every one of our events. So, yes.
Not long ago, a presentation on who Putin is. And in that presentation, summarized very quickly, he's a former KGB operative who gained credentials and chips and assets, is a legitimate international player, actor on the international scene, but who at any time could go rogue. The presenter thought this was predictable. I thought it could not be predictable. So, okay, he went rogue. He had no legitimate reason because there's no way that the Ukrainians could have prevented the Russians from supporting their naval base at Sevastopol. So, and he used a tactic which the Soviet Union, rather Stalin used in converting all the liberated countries, including Poland, to becoming socialist East European communist countries by the use of the Russian army. The Russian army would go first, would support the party that the Russians wanted and suppress the others and gain control that way. So from that respect, what he did was not unprecedented, but it not legitimate according to the current standards. So my question is, given the fact that he's gone rogue and has broken international norms of behavior, is this the beginning of the end for Putin? For all of you.
Well, is it the beginning of the end? Before the annexation had become formalized, I wrote something for Foreign Affairs called Putin's Own Goal. And the basic point of the piece was that this could work out badly for him. I think we shouldn't necessarily see it as an unqualified success. Mainly because I thought it was inevitable if Crimea was annexed that the West would respond with sanctions and isolation, and that would cause medium-term pain for the Russian economy. Okay, so the points I've already made, but you know, I'm pretty bad at prognosticating the fate of individual Russian leaders, so I'm surprised by how successful this has been domestically so far, but I think in the medium term it's maybe going to look different. But you know, that's 3 to 5 years out. That's not over the next 12 months probably. And it depends on how events develop, obviously. If there's a Russian military move into southern and eastern Ukraine, then that would up the stakes enormously. And I think Russia would find itself in a much different situation than it found itself in Crimea in terms of what happens on the ground in Ukraine. You know, signs over the last 48 hours are that's not currently on the agenda, but many people, including me, did not expect the quick move into Crimea either. We thought that would be a bit too risky, but that's what happened. So
I mean, I think that the problem here, and it's, you know, it can be seen in the sequence of first Georgia, now Ukraine, is whether there's a tactic of taking steps that are below the threshold of a powerful response, and then pauses to allow the attention to drop, and then taking the next step. And that's the most unfavorable interpretation of what's going on, and that one could imagine that there are further steps, Central Asia, other places, where in part of the Putin vision that maybe things happen. But, I mean, the difficulty is, it was true in the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and it's true in Crimea, is that everybody's sitting around saying, well, this will be hard to reverse absent the 500,000 troop version of the Kuwait liberation. And so it's hard to, I mean, how long can you sustain coercive sanctions if you don't think you can coerce with them? And so there will be a tendency over time, if he plays it in those terms, to sort of say, well, you know, there are other things going on, and we're not going to get him out anyway, so what are we doing the sanctions for anyway? And so if you think about it from their coercive dimension, they kind of lose their force, and they're harder to sustain as a preventive deterrent function, especially as time goes on, if there's not another provocation. So I think that's the real challenge here, is he patient enough and deliberate enough and clear enough about the objectives to meter it out in a way that affects the overall response of the international community. And that, of course, you know, we sort of think a wily person would play it that way, but do we know enough about Putin to know whether that's the case or not? So far, so good, if you go from Georgia to Crimea. But, you know, I think the next, you know, year or so will be telling about whether he said now seeks to turn the heat down, appear to be more reasonable. I mean, a lot of it's not just Crimea, by the way. We haven't talked about it, but there's a whole bunch of other things, I mean, Ukraine, that are at stake. We've seen, for example, there was a sort of brief flirtation about not having the arms control inspections go forward, but then he reversed that. He's clearly tried to put a kind of double line under the sanctions by saying the tit for tat's over, right, because he doesn't want any more. There are a lot of other things that could be done on both sides, but you see both sides kind of looking right now to sort of, as I say, focus on de-escalating the crisis rather than undoing the provocation that took place.
we need to move on to other, Ernst, we need to move on to other people because we're running out of time. Yes, you've been very patient here. Yeah.
So it's seems to me that the historical context matters here, understanding where Putin's coming from, and you've mentioned that he's coming from a weakened state, feels threatened by the West's movement towards his border, NATO expansion, so on and so forth. So, as such, and taking that historical context into account, how does the U.S. effectively respond in immediately de-escalating, right? If the U.S. continues with sanctions and pressuring Russia, does that not feed into Putin's, further feeling threatened and so on and so forth? So I guess that's a question for the whole panel, but.
I mean, for me, the problem is how much priority do you put on de-escalation as opposed to deterrence and sort of system maintenance related things? Because if you accept, I accept, but Brian will talk about this, that Putin has, as you say from your example from TV, that he doesn't think of himself as the bad guy here. He thinks of himself as the victim. But everybody does, because everybody, as you know, have their own history, right? And so, we think about the island disputes in East Asia, and the Chinese say they took it away from us 100 years ago. It's time we got it back. Same true. It's absolutely the same true. And so the question is, you can always prioritize de-escalation. And as Secretary Clinton said, we have a very famous case of that in the center of Europe in the mid part of the last century, right? And so that was clearly, Chamberlain's priority. And you can think of lots of reasons to do it, and it's always a judgment call about whether that should be the priority here. The fact that, because you can make the argument either way, which is you can make the argument that if you prioritize de-escalation, you prevent the rally around the flag effect and all that. But you also can make the argument that you prevent an opposition from coalescing around him to say that Russia will be hampered in its economic interests and other things by keeping this guy in power. So the question is, if your long-term goal is political change in the country that created the bad thing, there are arguments in both directions as to whether to keep the pressure on and try to force the public there to rebel against the leader who's caused this problem, or take the pressure off so that they won't rally around him for nationalist reasons.
Just one further point on what Dean Steinberg was saying. I think I have assumed that because this was the first forcible territorial annexation in Europe since the end of World War II, the Europe and the United States would remain fairly united in opposing it and be willing to go the long term in terms of isolating and sanctioning Russia. That might be wrong, right? I think Putin's betting that, well, a reset comes along every few years, and a few years there'll be something else they need to deal with me about. Russia's a big, important country, plays in a lot of regions. They're going to have to come back and just forget about Crimea and say that's over. I'm sort of betting that, especially many EU member states, see this as something entirely different, where a part of Europe, a European country, has been taken by force. And therefore, they're going to be willing over the medium term to continue to isolate Russia. But I could be wrong. Maybe they'll decide gas is too important or other issues are too important to them. And they'll go back to trading and dealing like nothing happened in a few years. You want to?
Yeah, I suspect the red line is really the mainland. My sense is that Crimea is kind of gone for everyone, and nobody's obviously saying that it's gone, but that's kind of a de facto. I think everyone's accepted that, and Putin said in his sort of annexation endorsement speech, he basically said, if you leave me Crimea, I'm not going to be moving in anywhere else with the military. So that's his message, and my sense is that it's kind of being taken on board. So that would be my interpretation of kind of everything that's happened after the annexation.
All right, I'm going to take two more questions. Two people have been waiting very patiently. Paul, did you still want to get in?
Yeah, it's kind of a big question. But, you can read a lot of different analysis of the situation, and different one from Foreign Affairs around the same time of years, I think by Alex Blow, who basically said that should these eastern, Russian-speaking or Russian-oriented areas of Ukraine be taken, it actually would not be that big of a deal. It might even be a net plus for the region and for Ukraine, because this is a long-standing tension within the system. It would allow Ukraine to coalesce around Kiev and become more Western-oriented. They're net takers from those areas are net takers from the Ukrainian budget, so Russia would get to deal with that. That's a pretty iconoclastic argument, but he did make that, right? People shouldn't really worry about this. Too much if it happens, and the region might be better off for it. I wonder if the three of you could respond to that argument if you choose from your different perspectives.
I don't think there's any obvious place to draw that new line, right? To say, yeah, we're going to say these parts of Ukraine are going to associate with Russia, and the West is going to become more coherently Ukrainian and identify with the West. For one thing, I don't think Russian elite around Putin thinks that Kiev can be part of that part that associates with Western Europe, and we're going to say goodbye to Kiev, which, according to Russian historical mythology, as you know, is the origin of Rus, right? So I don't see any way operationally to take that as a serious proposition for sort of resolving this.
The problem, Paul, as you know, is that there are a lot of historical analogies to this. And Saddam Hussein's argument about Kuwait was, it's just the 19th province, let me have it, everything will be fine, and that's the way things were. And so, I mean, there's a reason why we've normally resisted territorial readjustments. For those of us who are now preoccupied with the 100th anniversary of World War I and watching the attempts to try to solve problems through territorial readjustment, and it just leads to the next territorial readjustment. So 2 Balkan Wars, and we ended up with World War I because nobody was ever satisfied with the various forms of territorial adjustment that were made there. So I think, it's just difficult, as Brian says, to know where this ends, and so then does this, go back to the Hungary-Romania problem and, the Hungary-Slovakia problem. And so I think it's, there's a good reason for saying, yes, autonomy and all these things that give people, but you don't really solve problems by these kinds of territorial readjustments.
Yeah, as our foreign minister said, like a week ago, somebody asked him, what about the Belgian scenario for Ukraine? And he said, well, we also would need the king and the chocolate.
They have the chocolate.
Yeah, that's true. We've got the chocolate, so there's only lack the king. So I mean, let me just repeat what I already said. I don't think there is any other equivalent of Crimea on the Ukrainian mainland that you would say, well, this is sort of quite naturally and peacefully can become either an autonomy or part of another state. So, yeah, I agree that it's not really how it looks.
All right, and last question, Horace Campbell.
Yes. I'm a bit taken back by the discussion because there's no discussion about the expansion of NATO and the legitimacy of the expansion of NATO. One of the panelists was involved in the discussion of NATO's intervention in Libya. And we've seen the devastating consequences of that NATO intervention and what NATO did. So what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union and the expansion of NATO is clearly a driving force behind what is happening, and we have not discussed that.
Yes, we have, Horace. Actually, we talked about it before you came in. Secondly, we talk about the international political system, but we have said nothing about international economic system. That there is a profound economic crisis that we are going through, and the situation in Europe is unstable because of that crisis. Yesterday in France, the far right won major gains, and this is something that is sweeping Europe. What is the importance of the far-right parties in Ukraine and their relationship to the political international system? Why would the rabbi in Kiev ask all Jewish people to leave Ukraine? It seems to me we're talking about this as if we've forgotten what happened in 1933, that in the midst of an economic crisis, that people intensify xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and with the kind of instability in the world, the forces in the United States that are calling for the President of the United States to intervene because he's weak, we who are intellectuals should be taking a very clear and different position about what's going on in Ukraine. I answered on NATO. We talked about that at some length. As I said before, there are two views on that, and there's a legitimate argument as to whether that was either the cause or the failure, actually, to attach Ukraine more closely to NATO that caused this current crisis.
I'm not sure about the right wing. I mean, there's clearly, in any sort of post-revolutionary scenario, there's clearly, as I mentioned, the risk that more radical actors become more prominent, especially if there's violence that has been involved. But frankly speaking, there are no representatives of extreme right wing in the current Ukrainian government. The presidential race is starting this week. Nobody from extreme right wing is running for president. They're not in parliament, obviously, because the parliament has not been re-elected yet. There has not been credible reports. We're not really talking about the kind of disturbing images that are perpetrated by some news media, but they're not really credible reports of inter-ethnic violence, anti-Semitism, racial violence in Ukraine at the moment. I think the government is very well aware of the fact that the rise of paramilitary groups of whichever ideological setup is a concern. And it's sort of a concern, this question of this sort of monopoly of violence within the state, control over the territory, issues of public order. It has tried to deal with this, to sort of incorporate some of the paramilitary group into the new National Guard units, demanding that all the other legal weapons are being handed over, and it's sort of trying to kind of demilitarize the situation. As already mentioned, the presence of Russian troops on the other side of the border is not helping this, because people feel that they might need to prepare for war, and that's what's being exploited again by some kind of more extreme radical groups, not only right wing but also left wing. So there are obviously very legitimate post-revolutionary concerns, but I don't really have any evidence from Ukraine that would show this kind of massive Nazi takeover of Ukrainian political process at the moment. That there's always a risk, I suppose, in a highly unstable situation, and so the hope now, beyond the question of what should have happened with NATO in the post-Cold War era, is really how much sort of what is the right combination of sort of incentives, sanctions, inducements, support that would help stabilize the situation to the degree that radical voices have no purchase in the country, and so kind of more dialogue and more reform-minded people get more stage. That's obviously the challenge.
I would just say one final thing about the NATO piece. NATO membership for Ukraine has been incredibly controversial within Ukraine since 2004 in the Orange Revolution, and there has never been majority popular support based on public opinion poll for joining NATO. And I think it was in 2010, there was actually a law passed saying that Ukraine would not join NATO.
There's no legal basis in Ukraine at the moment to join NATO.
Yeah. I don't anticipate it being on the agenda in the short to medium term, because the Ukrainian population is too divided about the prospects of that. And even the EU issue is not really a live issue, because Ukraine would have to travel so far in terms of domestic, legal, political, and economic reforms that it wouldn't be on the agenda for at least, I would say, 8 to 10 years at the very earliest. So I don't see either of those things as being necessary to resolving the crisis, because I don't think they're currently on the immediate agenda for Kiev. They have much bigger problems to worry about right now. Thank everyone for coming. I thank you for your questions, and I thank the panelists also.